Three officers thought they had chosen the perfect target: a single father in a battered work truck, who looked like nothing more than an electrician passing through a neighborhood about to be sold out from under its people. And for 30 more minutes they believed it completely, mocking him, circling him, ordering him onto the hood of his own vehicle in front of strangers who were too frightened to look away. Grant Holloway never raised his voice and never reached for his pocket, because he understood something the three men in uniform did not yet know, which was that the moment their body cameras went dark, a silent countdown had already begun inside the truck they were so casually destroying. He simply checked his watch, told them they had less than half an hour to undo what they had just started, and waited, because waiting was the only weapon he needed. If stories like this keep your attention until the very last second, stay close, because what happens to these three officers in the next 30 minutes will follow them for the rest of their lives. Grant Holloway moved through his kitchen the way he moved through most mornings, quietly, efficiently, and with one eye always on his daughter, who sat at the counter eating cereal while drifting through nothing but her own thoughts before school. Avery Holloway was 17, sharp enough to notice things her father tried to keep ordinary, and she noticed immediately that the case he carried that morning was not his usual bag of electrical tools, but a sealed gray container stamped with markings she did not recognize. She asked him where he was headed, and he told her only that he had an inspection to run near Foundry Row, a name that made her set down her spoon because she had heard the stories drifting through town about police towing cars and detaining people for almost nothing in that same neighborhood. Grant told her not to worry, the way fathers tell daughters not to worry when they themselves are not entirely certain, and before he left, he reached beneath the steering column of his old Ford pickup and checked a small switch that most mechanics would never think to look for. Avery watched him go from the window, the way she always did, holding on to the quiet hope that this day would be like every other day, ordinary and forgettable, even though something in her chest told her it might not be. The house they lived in had grown quieter since her mother passed, and in the years since, Grant had learned to fold worry into routine, packing lunches, checking locks, and never letting Avery see the moments when his own composure wavered. He had built a life around steadiness, choosing a job that let him pick her up from school most afternoons rather than chase the kind of advancement that would have pulled him away from her entirely. That steadiness was precisely what made mornings like this one harder than they appeared from the outside, because every assignment connected to Foundry Row carried a weight he never fully explained to his daughter. He trusted the protocols built into his vehicle, trusted the people overseeing his work, and trusted that whatever waited for him on that street could be handled the same careful way he had handled everything else since the day his world had narrowed down to just the two of them. The truck Grant drove had been on the road for more than a decade, its paint dulled by sun, and its bed lined with scratches that told the story of a man who worked with his hands, and to anyone passing by it looked exactly like what it pretended to be, a tradesman's vehicle, and nothing more. Underneath that ordinary exterior sat 4 independent cameras, a hidden tracking module, and a storage system that synced automatically to a secure server controlled by the State Attorney General's office, because Grant was not simply an electrician inspecting wiring. He led the technical team for a special integrity oversight commission, formed after dozens of complaints surfaced about public cameras around Foundry Row, mysteriously losing footage at the exact moments residents tried to report police misconduct. His assignment that morning was simple on paper, a routine check of a control box mounted behind a small diner owned by a woman named Laurel Bennett, one of the last holdouts in a neighborhood being slowly emptied by a real estate company called Harrington Urban Holdings. Foundry Row had once been a strip of family-run shops and modest storefronts, the kind of street where everyone knew the names above the doors, but over the past 2 years Harrington Urban Holdings had bought up nearly every building on the block, leaving only a handful of stubborn owners who refused to sell no matter how many citations, towed vehicles, or strange mechanical failures suddenly appeared in their lives. Grant understood the pattern before he ever stepped out of his truck, because the complaints he had reviewed all shared the same shape, the same convenient gaps in camera footage, the same officers showing up again and again at the edges of the story. When he parked near Laurel's diner, he noticed a patrol car sitting across the street far longer than any normal traffic stop required, its presence too still and too deliberate to be coincidence. Sergeant Wade Harlan studied the old pickup through his windshield, then lifted his radio, and within minutes 2 more patrol units rolled in from opposite directions, sealing the block before Grant had even opened his door. Grant recognized the speed of that response for exactly what it was, a reaction far too aggressive for a parked truck that had broken no law, and he quietly activated the emergency archive setting built into his dashboard without revealing a single detail about who he actually was. He intended to observe first and speak only when necessary, a habit built from years of watching how quickly a situation could be twisted once someone decided to perform anger for an audience. Sergeant Harlan stepped out of his cruiser with the unhurried confidence of a man who had walked this exact scene 100 times before, certain that nothing waiting inside that old truck could possibly threaten him. He stopped directly in front of Grant's bumper, rested one hand near his belt, and delivered the line that would later be replayed more times than he could ever have imagined. "Step out of the vehicle. Slow. Men like you usually have more hiding than what's sitting on the surface." Grant lowered his window with the calm patience of someone who had heard far worse before, and asked politely what the reason for the stop might be, though he already suspected no honest answer would arrive. Harlan ignored the question entirely, and instead asked how much money a man could make sneaking around a construction site dressed like a repairman, his tone dripping with the kind of contempt that came easily to someone used to being obeyed without resistance. Grant explained, evenly and without defensiveness, that he held legal access to the camera housing under a city contract, a statement that should have ended the conversation in any reasonable encounter. Harlan looked over the worn jacket, the scuffed boots, and the dented truck bed, then laughed under his breath, telling Grant that someone dressed like him had no business holding any contract worth mentioning. Officer Cole Danner stepped forward and demanded license and registration, both of which Grant produced without hesitation, every document current and entirely in order. Unsatisfied by the absence of any real violation, Danner claimed the rear license plate was too dusty to read clearly, an excuse so thin it would later sit awkwardly beside the official report. Officer Mason Reddick moved toward the truck bed and discovered the sealed gray case marked with state insignia, prompting Grant to calmly remind them that opening it without a warrant or legitimate cause would violate procedure they all knew by heart. Harlan treated the simple mention of procedure as a personal insult, the kind of reminder that wounded his pride more than any accusation ever could. It was then that Harlan noticed the small photograph tucked into the dashboard, a picture of Grant and his daughter, smiling at some forgotten birthday, and he seized on it instantly, suggesting that a single father, raising a teenage girl alone, should know better than to play lawyer in the middle of the street. Danner added that the girl would have to find her own way home if her father ended up spending the afternoon detained, a remark meant purely to wound rather than inform. For the first time, something in Grant's expression hardened, though his voice remained level, as he asked them plainly not to bring his daughter into whatever performance they were staging for the block. Harlan, sensing he had finally found a soft place to press, ordered Grant out of the truck entirely, and Grant complied without resistance, keeping both hands visible the entire time he stepped down onto the pavement. Danner pulled out his personal phone and began filming, treating the moment less like an investigation and more like entertainment for whoever might watch it later, while a few residents lingered at a distance, too familiar with Harlan's reputation to risk getting involved. Inside her diner window, Laurel Bennett watched the scene unfold with the particular dread of someone who had lived this exact humiliation herself more than once. Harlan leaned close to Grant and asked whether he had the money for a lawyer, and when Grant answered that the question had nothing to do with the stop itself, Harlan only smiled wider, telling him that on Foundry Row he alone decided what mattered and what did not. Danner laughed loudly at that, while Reddick, visibly uncomfortable, found a reason to look anywhere but directly at the man standing handcuffed before him. Almost in unison, as though following an unspoken signal, Danner switched off his body camera. Then Harlan did the same, and finally Reddick followed, each man believing he had simply erased the moment from existence. What none of them understood was that the simultaneous shutdown of 3 separate body cameras within the same radius automatically triggered a hidden protocol inside Grant's truck, starting a silent 30-minute countdown at a monitoring center none of them knew existed. Grant glanced at his watch, registered the exact second the clock began, and spoke without raising his voice at all. "You just started a process none of you can stop now," Harlan asked, almost amused, whether Grant believed he was threatening law enforcement, and Grant answered simply that it was not a threat but a notification, a distinction Harlan had no patience to consider. Danner mocked the idea outright, promising that within 30 minutes Grant would be sitting in a holding cell while his truck rotted in an impound lot somewhere out of sight. Harlan ordered the handcuffs locked into place, citing non-compliance with an investigation that had never actually been defined, and Grant allowed it without a struggle, fully aware that any resistance on his part would be twisted into something far uglier on paper. They pressed him forward against the hood of his own truck, posing him the way they might pose a dangerous suspect, rather than a man who had broken no law, and Danner shouted toward the gathering onlookers that they had just caught someone trying to break into private property. Grant asked, calmly and clearly, what exact charge justified his detention, and the 3 officers offered 3 different answers within seconds of each other: trespassing from one, obstruction from another, and threatening an officer from the third, each contradiction settling permanently into the recording systems hidden throughout the truck and along Grant's own jacket. Danner climbed into the cabin without consent and searched until he found a small camera mounted near the rearview mirror, then ripped it free and slammed it against the side panel until the lens cracked apart. Harlan watched with satisfaction, certain he had just destroyed the only evidence that could ever contradict their version of events, while Grant only glanced down at the broken plastic scattered across the asphalt and asked, almost gently, whether Harlan was certain that had been the only camera in the vehicle. Reddick, standing slightly apart from the others, noticed a small green light still blinking steadily from a control box tucked beneath the front seat, and quietly suggested they call their supervisor to verify exactly who they had detained before going any further. Harlan refused outright, worried that any formal verification might strip away the control he currently held over the situation, and instead instructed Reddick to write that Grant had resisted identification and attempted to conceal his intentions, a description that bore no resemblance to anything that had actually happened. Inside her diner, Laurel raised her own phone and began recording quietly through the window, until Danner spotted the motion and demanded she stop filming immediately. Laurel reminded him she stood on private property and had every right to record what happened outside her own door, though fear eventually pushed her hand down, even as the device kept recording from her countertop. Grant recognized the pattern unfolding around him instantly, the same threats, the same intimidation echoing nearly word for word through dozens of complaints he had already reviewed back at the commission office. This was not a random encounter born of bad luck, but a continuation of something deliberate, something built to protect interests far larger than 3 officers standing on a single street corner. He began asking short, simple questions, letting the men reveal far more about themselves than they realized. While 10 minutes into the silent countdown, the monitoring center detected 3 body cameras disabled within the same narrow radius at the same narrow window of time. Naomi Calder, head of the Office of Internal Affairs, received the alert immediately and opened a secure data feed originating from Grant's vehicle, watching in real time as he stood handcuffed yet entirely composed against the hood of his own truck. She placed an urgent call to Police Chief Lenora Strickland, then to Deputy Attorney General Maren Whitlock, setting in motion a chain of decisions that would reach Foundry Row long before the 3 officers ever expected company. Back at the scene, Harlan walked toward the truck bed, lifted the rear hatch, and found himself staring directly at the sealed gray case marked with state insignia he had dismissed only minutes earlier. For one unguarded second, his confident smile disappeared completely. The case bore a stenciled warning reading that it contained critical infrastructure equipment and was not to be opened without proper authorization, words that should have given any reasonable officer pause. Yet Harlan convinced himself the box might hold illegal surveillance equipment planted by Grant himself. Danner suggested they simply impound the entire truck and report that Grant had impersonated a city employee, an idea Harlan welcomed because it offered him a clean story to tell later. Grant warned them plainly that breaking the seal would be recorded the instant it happened, a warning Harlan brushed aside as he pried at the locking mechanism with a small tool from his belt. The moment the seal cracked, a second alert fired directly to the monitoring center, escalating the situation from passive observation into active emergency intervention. And within moments, a team from Internal Affairs was already moving toward Foundry Row. Stepping a short distance away from the truck, Harlan made a private call on his personal phone, telling whoever answered that he had found someone inspecting the neighborhood's camera systems and needed instructions on how to proceed. The voice on the other end insisted that Grant be detained further and that the equipment be transported somewhere outside official police custody altogether, a request so unusual it betrayed exactly how far this situation reached beyond ordinary law enforcement. A hidden microphone built into the truck's mirror assembly captured most of the exchange, and although Grant could not hear every word clearly from where he stood, he caught one name spoken with unmistakable familiarity, the name Harrington. Returning to the truck with renewed confidence, Harlan told Grant that a man dressed like a repairman had no business questioning the people who actually controlled this city, warning that continued defiance could cost him his job, his vehicle, and even custody of his own daughter. It was the closest Grant came to losing his composure entirely, though even then his voice stayed level as he told Harlan that he had just turned a situation that could have ended quietly into a criminal investigation with his own name attached to it. Danner, meanwhile, typed into the department system that Grant had attempted to trespass onto property belonging to Harrington Urban Holdings, adding a fabricated detail claiming Grant had threatened the officers directly. Reddick hesitated visibly over the keyboard before submitting his own corroborating statement, the system quietly logging the exact timestamp of every false word, even as the truck's hidden recordings preserved the very different truth unfolding outside. At the 18-minute mark, Strickland watched the recorded threat against Grant's custody of his daughter play out on her own screen, her expression hardening with every word. She ordered an immediate background check on all 3 officers, and the results revealed 17 prior complaints connected to incidents on Foundry Row, most dismissed for lack of evidence after cameras conveniently malfunctioned or footage simply vanished. The pattern had grown far too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, and Strickland understood she was no longer looking at 3 rogue moments but at a deliberate, repeated method. Down the street, a second patrol vehicle rolled quietly into view, and Harlan smiled, assuming reinforcements had arrived to support him, while Grant studied the plate number and recognized it immediately as belonging to the Special Oversight Unit, choosing to say nothing as Harlan's confidence remained dangerously intact. 12 minutes from now, you'll be explaining all of this without a badge on your chest, Grant said quietly, glancing once more at his watch. Harlan, sensing how many witnesses had gathered along the block, decided the safest move was to remove Grant from the scene entirely, ordering him placed into the back of a patrol car before anyone could ask further questions. Grant asked again what specific charge justified his arrest, and once more the three men offered conflicting answers, citing trespassing, obstruction, and threats against an officer almost simultaneously, each contradiction recorded permanently across multiple independent systems. The unmarked vehicle that had arrived earlier remained parked a short distance away, its two plainclothes investigators watching quietly without revealing themselves, since Naomi wanted enough evidence of intentional evidence, tampering, and falsified reporting before any direct confrontation began. Grant calmly mentioned that the truck carried a backup system stored somewhere none of them could reach, a statement Harlan dismissed as a stalling tactic meant to buy time. He ordered Danner to remove the memory card from what remained of the broken camera, and Danner returned holding an empty card deliberately placed there as a decoy, allowing Harlan to believe he now controlled the only existing evidence. In truth, the real recording equipment lived inside the taillights, the toolbox lining, and even the buttons stitched into Grant's jacket, each one streaming independently to a separate secure server, meaning that even total destruction of the visible truck would leave the actual record completely untouched, including the precise moments each officer disabled his own camera and falsified his own report. Inside her diner, years of quiet intimidation finally gave way as Laurel stepped through her front door and announced publicly that she had recorded everything happening outside her window. Harlan ordered Danner to confiscate her phone, prompting Grant to warn them that seizing a witness's device without legal cause would only add another charge to whatever they were already building against themselves. Harlan spun toward Grant and told him to stay silent, but Laurel refused to retreat, reminding Harlan directly that he had used this exact tactic against her own brother years earlier, a memory that clearly unsettled him more than he wanted to show. A shoe repair owner and a delivery driver stepped forward next, each describing past threats from Harlan's unit after refusing to sell their own properties, and the crowd's perception of Grant shifted entirely away from suspicion and toward sympathy. Danner grew visibly rattled under the weight of public attention, while Reddick quietly suggested removing Grant's handcuffs altogether, a suggestion Harlan refused outright, even as his authority began visibly slipping through his fingers. At the 24-minute mark, Naomi, Strickland, and Marin agreed there was more than enough cause for an emergency suspension, and Strickland electronically signed an order requiring all three officers to immediately cease duty and surrender their weapons and badges. Marin insisted the scene remain untouched, recognizing the strong possibility that this had become not just an abuse case, but a matter of destroyed evidence and witness intimidation as well. Sirens rose from both ends of the block almost at once, and Harlan straightened his badge with practiced pride, telling Grant that his backup had finally arrived. "No," Grant answered quietly. "They came for you." 3 dark SUVs rolled to a stop behind the patrol cars, and Naomi Calder stepped out first alongside a team from Internal Affairs, followed closely by Police Chief Strickland from a second vehicle, while Deputy Attorney General Marin Whitlock arrived with her own legal staff from a third. The crowd that had gathered along Foundry Row fell completely silent, sensing immediately that the balance of power on that street had just shifted for good. Harlan moved quickly towards Strickland, reporting that they had detained a dangerous individual attempting to break into private property, but Strickland walked past him without acknowledgement and ordered the handcuffs removed from Grant at once. When Harlan protested that Grant had threatened officers directly, Naomi simply lifted her tablet and played back his own recorded words threatening Grant's custody of his daughter, the audio carrying clearly across the silent street. Strickland then introduced Grant publicly as the lead technical officer for the city's Integrity Oversight Commission, and Harlan stared at the worn jacket and dented truck, unable to reconcile the man before him with that title. Grant told them plainly that his position had never been the point of the encounter, since the truth of what they had done would have been exactly as wrong, regardless of who he turned out to be. The real issue, he said, was what they were willing to do to any ordinary citizen the moment they assumed that person held no power to push back. Danner insisted weakly that they had simply been doing their jobs, prompting Marin to ask why doing their jobs required disabling 3 cameras, smashing civilian property, and producing 3 contradictory charges within minutes of each other. Reddick attempted to shift blame entirely onto Harlan, claiming he had only followed orders, and Naomi reminded him calmly that an officer's oath never required obedience to an unlawful command. Harlan accused Grant of orchestrating an elaborate trap, but Grant answered that he had done nothing more than park legally and ask them to follow procedures they already knew by heart, since nobody had forced them to disable their cameras, search his vehicle without cause, destroy his equipment, threaten a witness, or falsify their reports, choices that had built the very trap now closing around them. Naomi confirmed that the central server had already locked every relevant file beyond anyone's reach inside the department, while Harlan's personal phone was seized under formal order. The earlier call referencing Harrington flagged immediately as potential evidence in a far larger investigation. At the 28-minute mark, Strickland read the emergency suspension order aloud, and Harlan insisted she had no right to humiliate 3 officers in front of an entire street, to which Strickland replied that they themselves had chosen to turn public authority into public spectacle, meaning the return of that authority would be just as public. Guns down. Badges off, Strickland ordered, glancing once at her watch. Place all of it on the hood of the truck you just tore apart. Harlan refused at first, insisting that more than 20 years of service entitled him to better treatment than being stripped of his badge in the middle of a street, and Strickland reminded him calmly that this remained an emergency administrative suspension rather than a final verdict. Still, from the moment that order took effect, none of the 3 men retained authority to detain anyone, carry a service weapon, or represent the department in any capacity whatsoever, and any further resistance would result in immediate arrest for obstructing an active investigation. Danner broke first, his bravado collapsing entirely as he unfastened his weapon, set it on the hood, and reluctantly unclipped the badge that minutes earlier he had worn like a shield against consequence. The same phone he had used to film Grant's humiliation was confiscated as evidence, and the crowd watched the reversal unfold in real time, the loudest laughter from earlier now replaced by silence too heavy for anyone to break. Reddick reminded the group that he had suggested stopping Harlan earlier, but Naomi pointed out that he had still signed the falsified report and participated in the unlawful search regardless of his private doubts. He surrendered his badge while offering full cooperation, and Marin acknowledged the offer without promising any leniency in return, since intentions mattered far less than the actions that had already been taken. Harlan removed his own badge last, searching Grant's face for some flicker of satisfaction or triumph, but found none waiting for him there. Grant simply asked him to place it exactly where his own face had been forced down minutes earlier, and Harlan, with no remaining leverage left to resist, did exactly as he was told. At precisely the 30-minute mark, the countdown on the monitoring system reached 0, and 3 badges sat together on the hood of an old pickup truck that had been treated as worthless less than half an hour before. Naomi confirmed that all 3 men were suspended immediately and stripped of any authority to enforce the law, with formal termination decisions to follow after a disciplinary hearing, though none of them would be permitted to wear a badge again before that hearing concluded. Strickland personally removed the handcuffs from Grant's wrists. apologizing that a man performing official duties for the city had been humiliated by the very department meant to protect that city. Grant declined the apology on his own behalf entirely, gesturing instead toward the shop owners gathered along the sidewalk, the people who had endured exactly this treatment for years, with no one ever stepping forward to intervene. Laurel handed her phone directly to Naomi, revealing footage that captured Harlan invoking Harrington's name before he ever learned who Grant truly was, evidence that transformed the entire incident from a single reckless encounter into proof of an organized pattern of coercion. Several other residents came forward as well, offering their own accounts of harassment stretching back months, each new statement reinforcing the same troubling shape. Harlan, grasping for some final foothold, told Grant he had destroyed 3 careers simply to prove his own importance. "I didn't take your badges," Grant answered evenly. "I only recorded the moment you proved you no longer deserved to wear them." Naomi opened the call records pulled from Harlan's confiscated phone and discovered more than 40 separate contacts with Everett Harrington's office over the preceding 3 months alone. Within hours, the Attorney General's office sealed every towing record, citation file, and surveillance log connected to Foundry Row, and the pattern that emerged from those documents told a story far larger than 3 officers acting alone on one ordinary afternoon. Nearly every victim listed across those records had refused to sell property to Harrington Urban Holdings, and almost every harassment incident was followed shortly afterward by a fresh lowball offer from the very same company. Harlan himself had received no direct payments from Harrington personally, instead collecting so-called security consulting fees funneled quietly through a company registered under his brother-in-law's name. Danner had been living rent-free in an apartment owned by one of Harrington's holdings, while Reddick had received debt relief payments routed conveniently through a charitable fund that existed almost entirely on paper. Individually, each arrangement looked small enough to overlook, but together they formed an unmistakable financial bridge between 3 police officers and one of the city's most powerful men. Everett Harrington called a press conference within days, denying any connection to the events on Foundry Row and describing the 3 officers as individuals who had acted entirely on their own initiative without his knowledge or instruction. He insisted, with practiced composure, that he had never even heard the name Grant Holloway before reading it in the news. Yet the recorded call already in Marin's possession told a very different story, one in which Harrington's closest assistant had specifically instructed Harlan to detain whoever was inspecting the neighborhood's cameras. Harrington's legal team attempted to portray Grant as a bitter former state employee, using technology to settle old grievances against the police, drawing attention to the fact that he had once left the state force entirely. Grant addressed that accusation directly and without hesitation, explaining that he had walked away years earlier, after a corruption case involving fellow officers was quietly buried by people more concerned with reputation than truth, an experience that had cost him his faith in the system for a long time afterward. This time, he refused to walk away, fully aware that dozens of families along Foundry Row would continue being pushed from their homes if no one stood between them and the people determined to remove them. Reddick, hoping to reduce the weight of his own consequences, agreed to cooperate fully with investigators and turned over text messages and meeting schedules, linking Harlan directly to Harrington's head of private security. He admitted that the unit had been explicitly instructed to make life on Foundry Row difficult enough that holdout owners would eventually give up and sell, a confession that expanded the investigation into bribery, coercion, and obstruction of justice well beyond what anyone had initially expected. His cooperation might soften the punishment waiting for him personally, though it would never restore the badge he had already surrendered on the hood of Grant's truck. The consequences spread quickly beyond the police department itself. as the city council voted to suspend Harrington's entire redevelopment project pending further review, freezing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars almost overnight. Residents who had once been too afraid to answer Laurel's calls now sought her out directly, eager to add their own stories to a record that suddenly mattered. Harrington, who had spent years treating 3 officers as a convenient shield between himself and the consequences of his ambition, began to understand that those same officers had instead become a direct and very public road leading straight back to him. Buried within the truck's backup recordings, Grant later discovered a fragment of audio in which Harlan had once told his men that once the neighborhood stood empty, Harrington would remember exactly who had cleared the path for him. Investigators soon traced the pattern further back than anyone had initially expected, uncovering an earlier neighborhood on the far side of the city that had quietly emptied out under almost identical circumstances 3 years before Foundry Row ever became a target. The same private security firm appeared in those older records, and 2 of the officers connected to that earlier project had since been promoted into supervisory roles, suggesting the strategy had worked smoothly enough in the past that no one ever thought to question it again. Marin's team began cross-referencing towing logs across multiple precincts, slowly assembling a picture of a method that had been refined and repeated rather than improvised on a single afternoon. What had once looked like an isolated case of 3 reckless officers was beginning to resemble something closer to a quiet, practiced playbook, used wherever a developer needed land cleared faster than the law alone could manage. Grant found himself reviewing those older files late into several evenings, recognizing in them the same contempt, the same convenient camera failures, and the same residents who had simply given up rather than fight a system that seemed designed to outlast their patience. 1 month later, all 3 officers appeared before a formal disciplinary hearing, none of them wearing the uniform that had once defined their authority on the street. Harlan still insisted he had been singled out for political reasons rather than misconduct, while Danner repeated that he had simply followed the instructions given to him by a superior officer. Reddick, by contrast, accepted responsibility openly and confirmed every statement he had already provided during the investigation, a decision that visibly separated him from the other 2 men seated beside him. The evidence presented left almost no room for argument, beginning with the footage recovered from Grant's truck, followed by the activation logs proving exactly when each body camera had been disabled, then the falsified reports bearing manipulated timestamps, Laurel's independent recording, and finally the financial records linking each officer to Harrington's web of disguised payments. Every separate piece of evidence aligned perfectly with the others, leaving no plausible denial standing by the time the hearing reached its conclusion. When given the opportunity to speak, Grant made clear he was not asking for the harshest possible punishment out of personal anger toward 3 individual men. The greater danger, he explained, was never simply 3 corrupt officers but an entire system that had convinced them no one would ever check their behavior in the first place. He proposed several concrete reforms, including automatic alerts whenever a body camera was disabled, easier public access to complaint records, full independence for internal affairs from local department command, and a complete review of every towing incident recorded along Foundry Row. The board's decision arrived swiftly and without ambiguity, terminating both Harlan and Danner from the department permanently and revoking their certification to ever serve as police officers again, anywhere in the state. Reddick was also terminated and stripped of certification despite his cooperation, though his file would carry that cooperation forward for any future legal proceedings against him. All 3 cases were referred to prosecutors for potential criminal charges, closing the door permanently on any return to law enforcement within Ohio for any of them. The board also adopted several of Grant's proposed reforms with surprising speed, partly because the public attention surrounding the hearing made delay politically impossible, and within weeks, the department began installing automatic alerts that flagged any body camera disabled outside of an approved reason. A new civilian review position was created specifically to audit complaint records that had previously vanished into unexplained gaps, and Naomi's office was granted independence from local command structures that had long made meaningful oversight difficult to achieve. None of these changes erased the years residents along Foundry Row had already lost, but they offered something that had been missing for a long time, a system that no longer relied entirely on luck or chance encounters to catch its own failures. Everett Harrington himself was soon summoned before a grand jury, his company forced to halt its redevelopment plans entirely, while facing a growing wave of lawsuits from former Foundry Row business owners. None of the remaining properties could be seized through coercion any longer, and a company that had once treated local police as an extension of its own ambition now found itself dragged down by the very department records it had quietly manipulated for years. At the close of the hearing, Harlan turned to Grant one final time and asked whether he finally felt like he had won. "No," Grant answered. "A city only wins when no one else has to live through 30 minutes like mine." Months later, Foundry Row had not transformed into anything resembling wealth or polish, yet something had shifted in a quieter and more lasting way, since the random patrols and unjustified towing had simply stopped appearing on its streets. Laurel reopened her diner fully, and on one wall she hung a single photograph showing 3 badges resting on the hood of an old pickup truck, displayed not as mockery but as a quiet reminder for anyone who walked through her door. Beneath it, she had written a single line in plain lettering, stating simply that power must always answer to someone watching. Numerous television programs reached out, hoping Grant would tell his story on camera, but he agreed to only one interview, using it solely to advocate for camera reform and stronger protections for civilian witnesses willing to speak up. He made a point of refusing to frame the story as a war between ordinary citizens and police officers as a whole, insisting instead that people like Strickland, Naomi, and countless honest officers had been the ones who ultimately allowed the truth to surface at all. At home, very little changed in the rhythm of daily life, as Grant still drove Avery to school each morning in the same old truck, now repaired but never repainted. One morning, Avery noticed the faint scratch still visible across the hood and asked why he had never bothered fixing it properly. Grant told her the mark served as a reminder that appearances had never determined who deserved to be heard or believed. Avery smiled quietly, reached into the glove compartment, and placed a small handwritten label on the dashboard that simply read, 30 minutes. Driving through Foundry Row sometime later, Grant passed a new patrol car parked near Laurel's diner, watching as a young officer stepped out, greeted several residents by name, and switched on his body camera before beginning his shift, a small gesture that once would have meant nothing, but now meant almost everything. Grant did not need to stop or say a word because, for the first time in a long while, the system was simply working the way it was always supposed to, without him needing to stand in the middle of it. 3 officers chose Grant Holloway because they believed a single father in an old truck would have no one standing behind him, and 30 minutes later, the entire city saw exactly what the truth alone was capable of doing. Years from now, few people walking past that diner would remember the exact names of the 3 men who once stood on that street, but the lesson their choices left behind would outlast them entirely, carried quietly forward in cameras that no longer mysteriously failed, in reports that no longer contradicted themselves, and in a community that had finally learned its voice carried farther than it had ever believed possible.